Most people think the resurrection story ends with the empty tomb, but there is a strange detail hidden in the hours that followed that almost nobody talks about. After returning from the dead, Jesus did something deeply ordinary. He sat down and ate. Not once, several times. And the foods that appear in those moments are strangely specific. They were not luxurious foods, not symbolic offerings from kings, not ceremonial meals prepared in a temple, just simple foods from the ancient world. Yet these same foods appear again and again throughout Scripture, in moments connected to strength and healing, restoration, survival, and life itself. And what is fascinating is that modern science is now rediscovering properties inside these ancient foods that people in the biblical world seem to understand instinctively thousands of years ago. Because the ancient world did not separate food from healing, or healing from faith. In Scripture, nourishment was never just physical. Meals carried meaning. Certain foods appeared repeatedly in moments of covenant, recovery, cleansing, endurance, and renewal. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if modern society slowly replaced some of the very foods human beings were designed to thrive on? Tonight, we are going back to the resurrection story, not to examine theology, but to look closely at what Jesus actually ate after rising from the dead, and why those details may matter far more than most people realize. Because once you see the pattern, you begin to notice it everywhere in the Bible. And maybe in your own life too. The first appearance happens in the Gospel of Luke. The disciples are gathered together behind closed doors, terrified after the crucifixion. Rumors are spreading that Jesus may somehow still be alive, but nobody knows what to believe. And then suddenly, he appears among them. Scripture says they were frightened and thought they were seeing a spirit. But Jesus responds in a way nobody expects. He asks them a question. Have ye here any meat? Not a sermon, not a miracle. Food. And in Luke chapter 24, they give him broiled fish and honeycomb, and he eats in front of them. At first glance, this moment seems simple, almost unimportant. But in the ancient world, meals were loaded with meaning. And these two foods were not random choices. The first was fish. Fish appears constantly throughout the ministry of Jesus. Some of his first disciples were fishermen. One of his most famous miracles involved multiplying fish to feed thousands of people. Even after the resurrection in the Gospel of John, Jesus prepares fish for his disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. Again and again, fish appears in moments connected to provision, restoration, and survival. And there may be a practical reason for that. Long before modern science discovered omega-3 fatty acids, the ancient world already recognized fish as sustaining food. Coastal communities throughout the Mediterranean consumed fish regularly because it provided long-lasting nourishment, especially during physically demanding work. Today, researchers study fatty fish for its connection to cognitive function, cardiovascular health, inflammation support, and the nervous system. But something else happened over the last 100 years. Modern diets slowly shifted away from natural whole foods and toward industrially processed fats and oils. In many countries, fish consumption dropped while heavily refined vegetable oils and ultra-processed foods became normal daily staples. The result is that many people now consume more artificial ingredients in a week than ancient communities consumed in months. And perhaps this explains why the biblical world often viewed food differently than modern culture does. To them, food was not just calories. It was part of creation itself, something given by God to sustain both body and life. And that brings us to the second food Jesus ate after the resurrection. Honey. Few foods carry more symbolism throughout Scripture than honey. The Promised Land was described repeatedly as a land flowing with milk and honey. In Proverbs chapter 24, we read, "My son, eat thou honey, because it is good." And in one remarkable story from the Old Testament, Jonathan, the son of King Saul, becomes weak during battle until he tastes wild honey. Scripture says that immediately his eyes were enlightened. That phrase is fascinating because modern researchers now study raw honey for compounds connected to energy metabolism, antimicrobial activity, antioxidants, and immune support. Real raw honey contains enzymes, pollen, propolis, trace minerals, and bioactive compounds that processed sweeteners simply do not contain. But most modern honey barely resembles the honey described in Scripture. Commercial honey is often overheated, ultra-filtered, blended, or diluted. In many cases, the living properties that made honey valuable for thousands of years are heavily reduced during industrial processing. The food survived, but its original form disappeared. And maybe that pattern exists across much of the modern food system. Foods become more convenient, more shelf-stable, more profitable, but often less alive, less connected to the way they originally existed in nature. The ancient world did not need scientific language to understand this. They experienced food directly from the land, the hive, the tree, the sea. There was no separation between nutrition and creation. And perhaps that is why Scripture repeatedly connects nourishment with blessing, restoration, and healing. But there is one final food connected to the resurrection story that may be the most important of all: bread. Throughout the Bible, bread represents far more than survival. It represents dependence, provision, community, life itself. When Israel wandered through the wilderness, God provided manna from heaven. Jesus later taught his followers to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." At the Last Supper, bread became a symbol of sacrifice and covenant. And then something extraordinary happens after the resurrection. In the Gospel of Luke, two disciples walk beside Jesus on the road to Emmaus without recognizing him. They speak with him for hours, yet somehow their eyes remain closed. Only later, when Jesus sits down with them and breaks bread, do they suddenly recognize who he is. Not during a miracle, not during a sermon, during a meal. There is something deeply human about that moment. And there is another detail modern society often forgets. The bread of the ancient world looked nothing like much of the bread lining supermarket shelves today. Ancient bread was usually made from whole grains, stone-ground flour, and slow fermentation methods. Many loaves contained only a handful of ingredients. Modern industrial bread often contains preservatives, stabilizers, emulsifiers, refined sugars, and heavily processed flour, stripped of much of its original nutritional structure. Researchers now study traditional fermentation methods like sourdough preparation for their effects on digestion, blood sugar response, and nutrient absorption. Again and again, modern science seems to rediscover principles ancient cultures practiced naturally, not because they understood chemistry the way we do today, but because they lived closer to the rhythms of creation, closer to real ingredients, closer to natural preparation, closer to the understanding that food itself carried meaning. And perhaps this is the deeper pattern hidden inside the resurrection story. After conquering death itself, Jesus returns not with displays of worldly power, but with ordinary acts of nourishment: fish beside a fire, honey shared among friends, bread broken at a table. Simple foods, simple moments. But maybe those moments were never truly simple, because modern life has become increasingly disconnected from the natural foundations humanity lived with for thousands of years. Meals became rushed, food became engineered, nutrition became outsourced to factories, labels, powders, and synthetic additives. Yet throughout Scripture, healing and nourishment remain deeply connected to the natural world God created. Olive oil, wine, grain, fish, honey, bread. Not isolated chemicals, not artificial formulations, real food. This does not mean ancient people had perfect health, and it certainly does not mean modern medicine has no value. But it does raise an important question. What if many modern health struggles are connected not only to what we eat, but to how far food itself has drifted from its original form? Because the Bible consistently presents the body as intentional design. Scripture calls it a temple, something worthy of care, something sacred. And maybe that is why these details survived for thousands of years inside the resurrection story. Not accidentally, but because they still have something to teach us. Perhaps the foods Jesus ate after the resurrection were never only about proving he had physically returned. Perhaps they were also quiet reminders of the kind of nourishment humanity was created to live on. From the very beginning, simple, natural, alive. If this video changed the way you see the Bible, subscribe to Food from the Bible for more documentaries exploring the hidden connection between Scripture, ancient nutrition, and modern health. And tell us in the comments, which biblical food do you think modern society replaced the most? I read every comment, and your answers help shape what we cover next. Until next time, take care of the body God gave you.